I met Lucinda when she came to give a speech at the Perry Mansfield Summer Arts Camp in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. I was a scholarship student there. It was my last year. And they were having, I think, their 75th anniversary or something, maybe 175th, I don't know. But they were inviting back famous alumni and just general alumni. And Lucinda was the keynote speaker because she had gone there when she was 16, I believe, 15, where she met Dustin Hoffman. Yeah. And so Lucinda came, gave a speech, showed some videos, and we performed our end of season performance, as you do as students. And then she came and watched class. And after the class, she gave me her card and said, if you're ever in New York, give me a call. A few years went by, I moved to New York. It didn't happen initially. I danced for other people first, and then I did finally call her after a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and she said she would be having an audition soon. And there was, in those days, it was in the newspaper. It was in the Village Voice. And I saw Lucinda Childs is having an audition, so I showed up. She remembered me, and she hired me. So, and that was in 1991, I guess, yeah. Yeah, she had a full-time company then, as it was, and so I danced with her for a few years. I took a break. There was a break in the company, and I went and apprenticed with the Cunningham company during that period. And then I came back, I guess, in 93, yeah, 92, 93. Yeah, and stayed with her until I moved to Europe, which was in 98. And then after that, because she finished her company then, she took a break from having a company. And then she called me again in 2005, 6? Must have been 6. Yeah, to help her with a company in the Netherlands called Intro Dance. She was setting a piece of hers that I had danced, and she wanted to know if I would help her. And I was like, sure. And then that started again. I helped her with a couple of operas and with a couple other ballet companies in Europe staging her works. And then in 2009, she called and said, there's a restaging of Dance. Would you come and help me with it? And we did that, and then there was Einstein on the Beach, and then also through discussions Available Light came up, so it ended up being a almost 10-year run. I think one of the things of working with Lucinda, dancing her work, specifically the work has helped me with, is to be clear. It sounds simple, but her work is simple in some ways, but there's a clarity to it, both conceptually and physically, that I never found with anyone else. And also I realize from working with her is a strength of mine now, probably due to her, partially my own nature and partially because of what she demanded of us. And that I really appreciated. There's so much extra in dance often, and so not only in the way things are danced, the actual steps or the physicality, but also choreographically in terms of concepts. There's a very beautiful quote, which I will misquote terribly, from Susan Sontag, that something like, Lucinda Child's work assumes that dance is a noble art. Something like that, we can look it up. By the meaning that it doesn't require artifice or story or extra, it assumes that dance in and of itself is enough. And and that was evident even before I knew that quote. It was evident in working with her that it was just this, and this is enough. You don't need to smile, you don't need to frown, you don't need to do anything extra, it's just this. And just that is more than enough. And that I always found really powerful and important. Yeah. I mean, Lucinda's contributed a lot, I think, also very quietly to the dance field. She sits on a lot of panels, a lot of juries. She also, and she does it very quietly. She's often not credited for things she does. She did a lot with the Halm Trust. She's done a lot with things like this. I don't even know, because she drops these things to me and she's like, well, I have to go because I'm doing something for the Mary Vigman Foundation. I'm like, I'm her assistant. I don't even know what she's doing. So she does a lot of things like this very quietly and very behind the scenes, because I think despite maybe how her public persona is seen, she cares very much about dance. She's very passionate about the importance of dance and dancing. And she gives money to things, she lends her name to things. She'll do anything she can often, but again, very quietly. It's often not a big production, but she'll call people to give money. She'll speak to other people to do things. And so there's that, which I think, I'm sure a lot of people do, but I know with Lucinda, it's something that no one knows she does. It's a very kind of under the radar thing. But in terms of her artistic contribution, I think a lot of it is again unseen because her work is so rare. It has served her in the end that her work is kind of a rarity in the world. It's not seen often. And it's worked in her favor because it's sort of we have a Lucinda Child's, the company is coming to perform this piece that hasn't been seen in 25 years. So there's always that kind of excitement around it. But I think often people don't recognize the contribution she's given because she's not as present in the public eye as maybe a Merce Cunningham or Martha Graham or even a Trisha Brown or a Bill T. Jones. But she certainly pioneered, and by pioneered I mean pioneered, like she had to fight for and continue to support her own work in the way it is, in this minimalist approach. It's what I said earlier about dance being enough, that having two people walk towards each other and just change direction is something. And I think those small contributions we recognize now or take for granted, this idea of minimalism, this idea of repetition, using dancers in the space to just change the space. Some people did it prior to her, a bit of Balanchine here and there, but I think Lucinda really distilled it down to something very specific that I think a lot of people use today, acknowledging her privately, but I think the public often doesn't recognize, oh, this is clearly inspired by Lucinda Child. I think also that Lucinda's work is seen a lot or appreciated in Europe a lot, and I think that has as much to do with funding as it has to do with um, a national dynamic or a national identity. The French really love Lucinda's work, but so do the Germans, so do Italians. But I think that has to do with funding. The possibility is there, and she's always been championed by different presenters in Europe. They really have loved her over the years, and they continue to present her work. And there's always popularity that goes with that. The years I was in the company, I think we only had one New York season in the 90s. In the 7-8 years I was there, and the rest of it was entirely in Europe. We didn't perform in the States once. There just wasn't an interest, I guess. I don't know. I was dancing in the company, so I don't know what the specifics were. But recently, we've toured America quite extensively, and Europe again. And it's interesting to see how those, the popularity or the flavor of the month sort of thing, how it rises and falls, because in those days, even in Europe, people were quite aggressive or confused about Lucinda's work. They would kind of love it, but then they would still boo. Some works were really too severe, too radical in their minimalism for audiences to sit through. They would just freak out. And we do those same pieces now, and they're just cheering. They're really like 7 curtain calls and bravos, and people afterward thanking us and wanting autographs and pictures with her, and it's very funny because it's just shifted, and the works are the same. It's exactly the same, and it's 10, 20 years later. So Lucinda has this great solo Katema that I found because there's a very beautiful film of it. It was filmed in the Kunsthalle in Zurich, and I think it was filmed in 79. But it was made in 78. And she told me that she did it while they were on tour with Einstein on the beach. That's when the film was made. She said they were in Europe on tour, and this filmmaker approached her, and she had just made this solo independently, and so they filmed it. And it's very beautiful, the film. And I saw it and said, would you mind if I learned it? And she said, no, but I don't have time right now. And I said, no. And she gave me the score and she gave me the film and was basically like, good luck. So, but that was great. It was sort of like archaeology and a bit of detective work to figure out exactly what was going on in the solo and in the film. And she gave it to me in that sense. So I performed it not that often, actually. I haven't had time because of the other things I've been doing, but I've performed it in Paris and Berlin, and I will perform it in a couple other cities in Europe coming up. But this was years ago, so it was sort of it was a hobby. The reconstruction was years ago. It was sort of almost a side hobby during the work with Lucinda. If there was a moment I would try to decipher things, I would ask her questions. What do you remember from this? And so that's how it came back. And I made a lot of mistakes, of course, over the time. And I slowly, as I was doing it, started to realize, oh, that's what this is. I see. And that is her work. It's very logical. It is very developmental, and it started to just make sense over the years. And so yeah, I did it basically on my own time and through my own interest. And the performances have come later. But we were working in Philadelphia doing a thing that was initiated by the Pew Charitable Trust called Dance Notebooks, I believe, in which they wanted to make a website of a lot of Lucinda's earlier works. And part of the project was to animate some of her visual scores. And so the animating of the score would match the dancing. And this was the first attempt at this. It's something she's wanted to do for years. And while we were in that process of setting these 3 or 4 older works, she said, oh, you know Katema, right? You figured it out. I said, well, to the point that I know it, yes. And we said, well, should we also put that in the program with the 3 or 4 other pieces? And Lucinda said, well, why don't we do it with 4 instead of 2? Then we can use more of the dancers. And so we started experimenting with we had them all coming at us, we had them all going away from us, from side to side, and then we decided on the 4 diagonals. And so we developed the solo into a quartet. And I've taught it as a solo version back to the original to her niece, Ruth Childs, who does it now in the program with 3 other pieces that I set on them that I reconstructed with them. So when we were in Philadelphia, due to time constraints, and we got to a point in creating Katema where we just sort of needed to come to an end to prepare it for the filming and to also give the dancers a chance to be solid in what it was, which was earlier in the score, in the movement and in the score than the solo itself continues. And so we've discussed several times whether or not to continue creating Katema or continue as the solo continues with the 4 women. And for her company, we didn't have time. And so at that point, she was like, let's just leave it as it is in the 6-minute version. And then when this opportunity came up, I said to her, do you want me to try to continue, or are you happy with it? And she did say she's quite happy with it. She said, I like the way it looks, but if you think they're up to it, go ahead and see if you can go a bit further and see what happens. So that's what we're trying now. I should say also that it was when she made it in 1978, it was the last piece that Lucinda made in silence, which a lot of her early works were made without musical accompaniment. She considers the walking and the moving to be music itself. And Katema was the last piece she made before creating Dance in 1979 with Philip Glass. And that was her first piece to a written score of music and from that point on, she never went back to making the pieces in silence. Or as she says, they're not really in silence, there is the sound of the dancing that creates the music. So she was was composing the sound as well as creating the choreography. So Lucinda told me that she titled the piece Katema because she had created it inspired by an inlet on Martha's Vineyard, a tidal inlet in which the water comes in, recedes, grows a little further, recedes, gets further and further, and it has some sort of Native American name that she remembers, but she didn't want it to be recognizable. She didn't want people to see the title of the piece and go, oh, it's that inlet in Martha's Vineyard. So she adapted the name a bit. So I don't know what the name of that inlet is, but she calls it Katema. And she often jokes about her own titles that way, that, for example, there's a piece that has a beautiful title called Radial Courses, with 4 people doing different circular courses. And she said, well, it's better than calling it 4 people running in a circle. That's sort of her joke about these sort of titles. And so I think with Katema, she just wanted to call it something that wasn't recognizable but had a mystery to it. And and I think that's what it is. Not that she didn't want people to know it was an inlet. She just didn't want it to be about that specifically. And I like that. I like that it is a nature study in its purest form, in a way. She really looked at something in nature, was inspired by it, and managed to translate it into her own work, which is about numbers, about accumulation, about repetition, about working in the space in a very concise way, that it maintains one diagonal and it doesn't change. The solo maintains the same parkour, the same path, and it doesn't vary. And that's how she translated looking at something in nature, as chaotic as nature is, and she found an order in it. She found a way to translate it into her system, which I find really inspiring and really beautiful, that it isn't as cold or as calculating as is often considered. And I see that in a lot of work, in a lot of painting, and a lot of music, that it is inspired by something other than what you would immediately expect. And also with Lucinda's work, I think in this piece also, there's a lot of very controlled, specific movement that repeats and is in unison and should be the same with all 4 performers. And I find, especially in today's dance climate, because it does change, there's such an emphasis on finding your own voice and who are you as an artist and how do you move, what is your authentic movement. And I always am confused by it, by this question, because I always find it in this attempt to do the same. If me and another dancer are trying to do the same step at the same time, in the same rhythm, in the same space, all I start to see are the differences. And those dancers become even more and more human to me. And I see it with the 4 women in this performance, or the 6 actually, that the more they do it, the more they try to be together, the more they aim for the same goal, you start to see the differences. They are 4 or 6 different people. And yeah, I think this unattainable goal of unison is really beautiful and noble. And then in that effort, in that unreachable effort, you see the humanity. And I find that much more emotional and touching than having a lot of people on stage expressing their own authenticity. Somehow this is, for me, much more touching. And so that's something that I always find very personal about Lucinda's work, that in that attempt is where the magic is. So.
I'm Ruth Childs, and I'm a British-American dancer. I was born in London. My mother is British, and then we moved when I was 2 years old to the States. I grew up in Vermont. Trained from a very early age in ballet, and then later on in contemporary dance, all through primary school and high school. And I was then, when I was 18, I moved to London and completed my classical training in London in a school there, and then ended up in Switzerland because I did a pre-professional junior contemporary company training there, and then ended up settling there and being based there as a freelance contemporary dancer. So I've been there for 15 years now. There was something very impressive about Lucinda, and I was definitely intrigued. And she was so different from everybody else in my family and that I was around. She was so striking, and she's also very funny and very charismatic and very beautiful. So obviously I was drawn to her, but I don't think I fully grasped like how important she would become, and she already was, for the dance world and what she was doing. And I think when I got that was really interesting in my teenage years, when I started seeing her work and really getting fascinated with it, and not just having people tell me, oh, this is your aunt Lucinda Childs, who's really important. When I could get it for myself, that was really cool. And also when I could feel like part of what she was doing, especially the mathematical scores and rhythms and musicality, and also her humor, which came out more through her theatrical and acting work, part of that felt really familiar. Really, like maybe I could see parts of my father and see parts of myself in that. So that felt interesting to be able to relate to and understand maybe more why her brain was working that way. It must be some kind of family link, but also parts of her are completely mysterious, of course. My collaboration with Lucinda is quite recent for several reasons. I really went off on my own path in the dance world from getting out of school around 2003 until now. I really explored a lot of contemporary work in Europe and worked as a freelance dancer for many, many companies, and I think I needed to do that before feeling comfortable approaching Lucinda's work. And I think Lucinda also needed me to do that for myself before thinking about collaborating with me. But then I think also Lucinda coming to think about what was going to happen when she was no longer around, and who was going to help her out, and what was going to happen with all her work, all her archives. She started reaching out to people, close people, and to me, asked me to assist on a project she was doing in France. And so I spent a week with her, I think. And then we got to talking. I was asking her a lot of questions, and I said, I said to her, why don't you teach me Carnation? And she said, because I remembered Carnation. I'd seen it on British television when I was visiting my grandparents there in the 90s, and I remember being very struck by that piece and finding it very funny, but also not having a clue what it was doing in the dance world, because I was completely in my nutcracker phase at that point. And so I just had this image and laughing about it, and also feeling the uncomfort of maybe my more traditional British grandparents not knowing what this was about. And Lucinda said, well, sure, of course I'll teach it to you, but I think you're not going to want to do that. You're going to get bored with that or something. I said, well, I would love to learn a little bit more about that time period. And then I said, people started getting super interested, obviously, in me reviving that piece. And then we added on 2 more, and we kind of made an evening program out of it. That was about 3 years ago, and that program has been touring all over Europe and a little bit here ever since. So it came up kind of naturally over a dinner conversation that we were having. And also, I think it hit at a time that was interesting for Lucinda because she was thinking about how she was going to carry on her work in the future. And all her archives have just been sent to Paris in the Centre National de Danse there. And so there was, just so happened that there was also this big retrospective. So then I was able to perform in that, and it just kind of hit at the right time for my career and for her career. People are also very touched by this project. I think it's very emotional for some people that have seen Lucinda performing the works and then see me do it. So Carnation is one of the major works from the Judson period for me. It's Carnation, 1964. She has a text in her archives about what was Carnation for her. And it's very funny, but it makes a lot of sense in retrospective. She said, it's like when you're getting ready to take a jump with a parachute and you need to check that you have everything you need before jumping. So for her, this table scene with the sponges and making sandwiches and then getting dressed and putting them in her hair and then putting this crown on, stuffing her mouth, and then putting everything in the bag was just getting ready for the next thing, which was then to go to the wall and go upside down. And I like this. So parachuting, jumping is kind of like an emergency situation. And I like how she compares what the actions she's doing in Carnation to this kind of leap into empty space. Carnation is a very clever, witty piece. It's a very good example of working with daily objects, which was then very, very used and still is in dance, contemporary dance today. It's a very modern piece. It's very funny and still gets people laughing even 50 years later. There are a few little references in there. One which is quite fun is, so there's the table scene, and then she goes over to the white wall and flips and makes the square, the rectangle on the white wall, and that's a definite reference to White on White by Rauschenberg, which is interesting. And then I also like the scene on the blue bag with the emotions scene. That's funny because people get really relieved that finally the performer, the dancer, is leaving the stoic face and showing some kind of emotions. But I like the fact that actually these emotions are choreographed. And Lucinda said, now you're on the bag, and the bag is making you smile, and then the bag makes you sad, and then you leave and you come back. It's just actions and emotions becoming choreographic, but at the same time they still are very emotive, and I like that play. It's an amazingly funny piece, but as we were talking about earlier, hard to perform because there's always something that can go wrong, a sponge that can fall off, or the sock that doesn't want to come on right, and it is quite stressful. Pastime, Lucinda's first solo from 1963, this is probably not the right word in English, but in French I like to say c'est un ovni, it's a UFO piece for me, in Lucinda's career. It's so clear and silly and rigorous and radical at the same time, and it's just a 10-minute piece with 3 little sections. The section that I'm teaching here is the second movement, which is the bathtub scene. Lucinda used a jersey tube dress and made kind of a bathtub out of it. And the only information she gave me, that's not true. One of the most important pieces of information she gave me about this movement of the piece was that she was in the bathtub and the water was on the outside of the bathtub. And I just love that. It's so silly, but she says it so seriously, and she takes it so seriously, and I love that about, I think it's just typical Lucinda Child's humor and seriousness mixed together. And another thing that I love about Pastime is the music. She explained to me that when this was an experimental time in the Judson dance theater, and they had task-based exercises, and sometimes they used ready-made or objects, or they were exchanging and experimenting with things, exchanging roles also between musician, dancer, artist. And Lucinda recorded her tap water at home to make the music for this piece, and then she kind of became the composer. But then she did exchange with a composer who was working with the group, Philip Corner, and he kind of made the music for the piece. But she got right in. It was a DIY. She just did everything. She did the costume, the music. And that was typical for that period. Everyone exchanging roles and trying things out. Yeah, so 1963. She was 23 years old, right out of Sarah Lawrence College. And she did actually perform the second movement a few times at a Judson Church kind of revival or honorary evening, maybe about 5 years ago in New York. Lucinda's work is feminist, it's classic, it's postmodern, it's dedicated, it's radical, it's innovative, it's also becoming pure and, as I said, classic, like, I don't know, it's so many things. But she is her work, I would say, more than anything. That's what she would say also. She has this thing about precision and rigor, and there's always a reason for every bit of her choreographic work. There's always instruction that goes along with everything. And even if the reason is completely absurd, there is a reason. And I like that about how she works. And she can always give you an answer for what the next step is in her work. And I like that she doesn't have this thing of, well, you just kind of go with the flow, and when you get to this part, you just kind of get into it or ease into it. It's like, no, now you put the bag here, and you go to the wall, and you turn yourself upside down, and then you go here, and you smile, and then you get sad because the bag is not making you smile anymore. And that's just great. I mean, that sounds completely absurd, but for her, it's a reason. For me, she's one of the most devoted people I know to art and dance. Seeing her do that for more than 50 years, and she's 77 years old now, and she's still doing it. That's an encouragement. That's a beautiful person to admire. And she didn't have the encouragement from her family that I had when she was young. She did it. Everything she did was on her own, basically. Her parents did not push her into dance. They did not want her to do dance. So she's very courageous, and that courage and devotion definitely gave me some kind of hope and reassurance in my own choices.
In the summer of 2016, I had the unique opportunity to learn and then later perform Lucinda Child's groundbreaking solo Carnation. It was a very exciting time for me as I was working on something so completely different from anything I had ever done before. Hope Moore came in and over the course of about a week set the work on me. I believe that there had been a little bit of apprehension as to whether I would really be interested in doing this type of work, or whether I could even do it, because it was so completely different from my experiences thus far, both in terms of my education and my performing career. My background was primarily classical ballet, as well as old-fashioned American modern dance, and then that sort of skipped over the postmodern era and went straight into European mixed repertoire. So I didn't really get that other perspective of performance that was explored during that time in New York City. Because it's task-based, there are so many things that come about as challenges and that can go wrong, because when you're dealing with props, you have to be ready for anything. And the rules of the game are that if you don't finish the task, you can't move on. So even though you don't necessarily have an infinite amount of time, you really just have to hope that things go well and you can manage to get through it. The second section involves the wall and the blanket and the sock. And for me, I'd say this was definitely the most challenging part of the solo, because I needed to be upside down for a significantly longer period of time than I was used to. So I spent the whole summer leading up to that practicing being in handstands and lowering myself onto my head, because at that point you have to let go and put a sock on and then open your legs so that the blanket covers you, and you blend into the wall as if you are somehow camouflaged by that. Beautiful balance between absurdity, humility and maturity, as well as pushing the bounds of what you can do with the audience, playing with them. So I had a blast. It was something so new to me that, like I said, it really played into where I was in my life, or where I kind of still am, which is finding ways that I can still be a dancer that doesn't require me to base everything upon sort of youthfulness, energy like that. It's more about what kind of situations can you create. Within these limitations, how far can your creativity go? And how much can you embody something so concretely and specifically and in such an analyzed and detailed way that an audience can just watch you play with a bunch of props and still think that you've done something tremendously entertaining and tremendously interesting. So thank you, University of Washington, and thank you, Hannah, for giving me this opportunity. I'll never forget it. Thanks.
So I started dancing at Milwaukee Ballet School, and I continued at North Carolina School of the Arts, where I got my high school diploma. I went to New York City then and graduated with my BFA from Tisch at New York University, and I danced with Lee Chao-ping Dance, Sky Better and Associates, as well as the Radio City Rockettes and the Ryrie Woodbury Dance Company. And doing the Pastime piece by Lucinda Childs was fascinating and really brought me back to dancing with the Nikolai Dance Theater because of the use of that tub, which was such an enormous part of the piece and a real struggle at first to work with any prop. And this especially because of the way it needed to stay level. And the fact that I didn't have a mirror or anybody else to look at, there was no other dancer on stage. So I had to really get a good proprioceptive awareness about my body, being my toes level with my shoulders. And we worked pretty hard on making sure that happened. But it took a long time, and the scooting around from side to side was particularly challenging, and it just didn't seem possible at first. I watched Ruth do it, and it looked so easy, and I got in the tub and thought, all right, I got this, and started, and I wasn't going anywhere. I was paddling with my arms, and things were shaking, and I wasn't moving, and it just took a long time for that to happen for me. And I still don't know if I would love to keep doing the piece, because there was just so much nuance in it. And I think because of its simplicity, it really lended itself to the involvement of my imagination, what was going on for me So before Ruth even came and set to work on us and talked to us about it, we had fabric made already. And so I got in the tub and I tried it out, and it was a bit of a struggle. And then we had another one made as well. So we had 2 different tubs, and there were different fabrics, and there were also different lengths. So that really gave us a feel for how fitted it needed to be, and that length really mattered in terms of the ability for me to get into the right shape and come in and out of the right shape and be held enough, but also having that stretch to be able to lengthen out completely. And then the fabrics made a big difference. One of them was kind of shiny and slippery on the floor, which allowed it to move easier. And the other one was more like a cotton, and it would just get stuck. And when you sweat in it, it just, you were like pasted on the floor. And also to that fact, it really mattered to me like what I was wearing every day. So I tried to wear the same pants. And then when it came time to choose a costume, together with Hannah, we talked about what looked good, but then also what was really easy and allowed itself to kind of fit into the aesthetic of that kind of sweeping from side to side without it looking choppy. I was so excited to perform a piece by Lucinda Childs. Just floored me. And the fact to have Ruth, her niece, come out all the way from Switzerland to talk to me about the piece was a real honor and a real gift. And she was so lovely. I expected her to be a little harder. And she did have this very poised way of talking to us about it. But very, very lovely and a good kind of, I've been with choreographers who, want to control every single aspect of it, and it feels a little stifling as an artist. And certainly I had that experience, with certain pieces, but Ruth wasn't like that. She conveyed what it was, but then allowed a little bit of room for you to embody it yourself. And that was wonderful. And I loved the fact that she also provided a background and a history to the piece and the different places it was performed and the different ways it was performed, which was truly fascinating. We saw a picture of Lucinda doing it on a table. So the audience was seated, and she was on the main stage, but on a table. I think because people were looking down, and so she needed to elevate herself so people couldn't see what was going on in between the tub. But that little bit of history was just wonderful to hear about, and gave me more sense of the piece and how this artist was thinking. So I really enjoyed being a part of Pastime.
One of the biggest challenges learning Katema was just memory. Remembering the dance. Because the phrases are so similar, they get muddled in the mind really quickly, and there's no room for error. So there's one small mistake and then the whole thing falls apart. So the stakes are pretty high as far as the memory goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would concur and just say that it requires this incredible attention to the present moment and to what you're doing in a way that you can't go on autopilot. No matter how well you know the dance, you think you know the dance, or how many times you've done it, autopilot doesn't work. You have to be totally present and attentive to what you're doing all the time, which is a challenge, but also very rewarding, I found, when we got it right. But I think in all of our runs, in both rehearsal and performance, we all 4 remembered exactly which phrase we were supposed to be on and executed it perfectly. How many times?
Maybe twice.
Maybe twice.
Twice where everybody did it right all the way through.
Yeah.
Luckily, those were on stage.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it was very difficult. Also because it's so spare. The little aberrations come to the surface really easily. So it's more pressure put on the memorization and the clarity of the direction and the timing.
Mm-hmm. And that said, the more you start thinking about those things and how important they are, again, it takes you off track, and you have to, at least for me, always bringing it back to, okay, just execute the task. What am I supposed to be doing right now? Just do that. That's a great challenge. I think there's also satisfaction in it being such a team effort. It's not just about what you're doing and, like the space or what you're doing with the choreography. It's really about you doing your part in relationship to these other people doing their part. And that's a kind of teamwork at a very deep and kind of fundamental level that was very satisfying for me as well. So yeah, when that curtain came down and we knew that we had done a perfect run, it was just like, woo!
Yeah.
So
I relied on the score in Katema visually. I'm a visual learner, and so when I was doing the dance, I would see the score in my head, and I would also see the notes that I had added to it in my head, especially in moments where there were transitions between the patterns. We also would recite the score to our respective partners for different parts of the dance together, so that we were imprinting that pattern even more.
mm-hmm.
In an oral sense, so there's sort of an audio track happening. And I know you were talking about how you would sort of sing it to yourself.
Yeah, for me, the score had a very particular, or each sort of chunk of the score had a particular rhythm that I learned that I could hear. And then once I knew which line of the score I was executing, I could kind of hear it. And also then Lucie and I were kind of working across from each other. And so, yeah, just reciting, kind of mouthing to each other where we were to keep ourselves on track was useful. I was less, I used I wasn't thinking visually so much about how the score was working. For me, it was more oral. But when in performance, but in learning it, I was like over in the corner with my score, definitely referring to it as I was, committing it to memory. So,
but what was also interesting was that even though Ty was encouraging us not to look at each other and to really sort of be independent and committed to what we thought the choreography was, because people were going to make mistakes, when I dropped a stitch, I would often check with Adele or check with my other partner and get back on the horse in a way. So, but it was because that rhythm was so driving and so consistent that I was able to do that. And also because I had imprinted the larger score in my head, so I would kind of have an idea of where I should be. And that was really interesting in rehearsing it, getting to the point where we could fall off of the choreography and then get back on. That felt really virtuosic in its own way, so that you can really know where you are and have the dance happening in your mind.
Yeah, and I think that rhythm kind of followed me around in my life more so than I've had the experience of other choreography following me around. I mean, I remember kind of falling asleep thinking 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. That became very much the soundtrack of those couple months of my life for sure.
When we were learning the dance, we started at a small scale, and so each movement is represented in the score by a particular letter. And there was X, Y, and Z, which were pretty much three only movements other than walking that we used. And then there were a few other turns also. There were kind of a chaîné turn with a whipping arm, and then a soutenu turn with a rond-de-jambe that we called asterisk because it was represented by an asterisk in the score. So once we had figured out those smaller phrases, we gave those names like side changer or tricky or basic, and then we just referred to them as that. But that was after we had mastered those chunks, so we were able to move to a second level of scale, so it was less fine, it was a little bit larger.
It's like learning our letters first and then putting them into words and then into phrases.
Yeah, and then finding the pattern of the phrases was the organization of the chunks. Yeah.
Ty has worked with Lucinda for so long that her style is sort of imprinted in his body and in his movement. So just seeing him do the movement over and over again, I feel like we got a lot of information from how he was doing it. And you could kind of really see Lucinda's style living through his body, which is really cool. And also I just think is a really neat way that dance in general is kind of passed down and passed from person to person through this sort of like, I don't know what you would call it, osmosis or something. Absorbing this person's sort of history with this style through interacting with them physically in the studio was really cool. And Ty has similar to Lucinda, he's kind of striking and tall and long and has that sort of regal carriage, and which I think is an important part of Lucinda's style that I hadn't ever really worked with before. So having him as a model to kind of mirror was helpful stylistically. One other thing I'd say about Ty is that he had also worked with Lucinda for so long that he kind of understood the pattern and like almost the rhythm of learning Lucinda dance. So he was able to almost anticipate for us sort of like, it'll be like this tomorrow, you know, kind of like, don't panic that your brain is completely scrambled. He didn't worry, you know, he just knew that he knew about the process and the sort of timing and the rhythm of learning a Lucinda dance. He had kind of like the long game, which I thought was interesting. And he was always right. And I remember one thing he told us was not to try to practice the dance before doing it. Like he was sort of like, you've got like one chance, once a day, you can do it. And it was true. Pretty much always we would do the dance in rehearsal and then we would want to do it again and fix what we had done wrong. And almost inevitably, it would just get worse from there. Our best run was always the first one. And I remember him saying that. And it's something I've thought about as a dancer because I think my tendency is to, like, before going on stage, practice the hard moves or go over everything. And it was helpful to just be like, no, just do it. Almost across the board, Katema was a favorite, which sort of surprised me since I think of audience pleasers as being more like dances that have more virtuosic sort of physical feats of athleticism and
music.
And music, right. I don't know what accounted for exactly the amazing response people had to Katema. What do you think, Luce?
A lot of my students really responded strongly to Katema, and many of them, it was their first dance show ever. So that was also surprising to me because it's so simple and pedestrian in its quality. But I think that people like puzzles, and I think that Katema really is a puzzle. And when I was watching the other cast dance it always struck me as a kaleidoscope. And there's something really satisfying about seeing these patterns morph and change and trying to figure out what the rules are, because you know there are rules and you want to understand them. It's not complicated in the way that some theater can be complicated, and you're like, but what am I supposed to understand from this? What's the story? What does it mean? I think it's very straightforward. It's about the patterns. And I think also, as my students mentioned, that they were surprised that there was no music, and that kind of intrigued them that the walking became the music. And so there's something kind of surreal about it also, even though it's such familiar movement, that it's still special.
I think there is a zenness to the simplicity. And also that's underscored by the aesthetic, I think. That, you know, it was 4 women in white in a very stark, clean stage. And I think of that also as being kind of a Zen type of aesthetic that I enjoyed. I think also there's something that felt particularly profound maybe in this time, this year in particular, of seeing for women dancing together in silence, not at all being sexualized or they were very, I think we struck a very powerful stance, both just in our costumes, in the how we were wearing our hair and our carriage. We were very strong, four very strong female characters, and I think people respond. I think there's a powerful response there as well.